You have felt a quiet ache inside you, a longing without a name, a silence that does not rest. You thought it was weakness. What if it is the beginning of your awakening? There is something stirring in the depths of sensitive souls in this age, a pull that draws them away from the clamor and toward the sanctuary of solitude. You have felt it, haven't you? This inexplicable desire to step back, to retreat, to find refuge in the quiet spaces that the world has forgotten. And perhaps you have been told that this is escape, that this is surrender, that this is the mark of a spirit too fragile for the weight of existence. But watch how the river in its wisdom knows when to slow its course, when the current becomes too turbulent. When the waters grow muddy with the debris of countless interactions, the wise river finds the deeper channels, the quieter pools, where it can clarify itself before continuing its journey to the sea. Your soul too possesses this ancient wisdom. It knows when the pace of engagement has become unsustainable, when the constant giving has depleted the very source from which your gifts flow. In the markets of human attention, where every voice competes to be heard above the din, where every soul is expected to perform its worth through endless availability, something essential is being lost. The delicate frequencies of inner knowing are drowned out by the louder demands of external validation. The subtle whispers of authentic purpose are buried beneath the avalanche of urgent but unimportant obligations that others place upon your shoulders. You have noticed, haven't you, how exhausted you feel after gatherings that should have nourished you? How hollow you feel after conversations that touched only the surface of what you know to be true? How depleted you feel after giving advice from a wisdom that seems to flow through you but never quite settles within you long enough for you to drink from its clarity. But let me whisper to you a truth that your soul already knows, a secret that the great mystic Kahlil Gibran understood with the clarity of desert stars. Your desire to withdraw is not the sign of a broken spirit seeking to hide from life. It is the wisdom of a soul that has grown too large for the small rooms that others call living. You are not running from the world, you are returning to yourself, to that sacred space where your true nature can breathe without explanation, without performance, without the endless need to justify your sensitivity to those who mistake depth for weakness. Gibran wrote of the soul as a bird that must sometimes return to its nest, not from fear of flying, but from the need to remember the songs it was born to sing. In the rushing streams of modern existence, where every voice clamors to be heard and every moment demands to be filled with noise, the sensitive soul finds itself drowning not in water, but in the endless chatter of a world that has forgotten how to listen to the whispers of the heart. Your withdrawal is not cowardice. It is the courage to honor what your spirit needs to survive and thrive in a world that often mistakes loudness for strength and busyness for purpose. It is the recognition that your energy, your attention, your very presence are sacred resources that deserve to be protected with the same care that a gardener protects the tender seedlings from harsh winds until they are strong enough to bend without breaking. Consider the wise hermit crab, who understands that growth requires the temporary vulnerability of shedding its outgrown shell before finding a new one that fits its expanding form. In the space between shells, it must retreat to safety, must choose solitude over exposure, must prioritize protection over the appearance of strength. This is not weakness. This is the fundamental wisdom of all growing things. The trees know this wisdom intimately. Watch how the mighty cedar does not apologize for needing deep roots, for requiring soil and space in the patient darkness where growth happens unseen. Notice how it draws its strength not from the approval of other trees, but from its connection to sources that run deeper than any surface interaction. The mountains understand this truth with the stillness of centuries. They do not explain why they stand apart, why they touch the sky while keeping their feet firmly planted in the earth. why they offer their peaks only to those willing to climb towards silence and clarity. In the sacred geometry of your own becoming, there are seasons when the soul must turn inward, like a flower closing its petals against the harsh light of too much exposure. This is not rejection of the sun. This is the wisdom that knows that even the most beautiful bloom needs the restoration that comes in darkness, the rejuvenation that happens when it gathers its energy for the next opening, the next offering of its fragrance to the world. Your soul is like the desert rose, which blooms not in the crowded gardens where every flower competes for attention, but in the vast, quiet spaces where it can unfold according to its own rhythm, where it can drink from hidden springs and draw strength from the very solitude that others fear. The world may call this isolation, but you know it as integration. You know it as the sacred work of becoming whole. Like the pearl that forms in the hidden depths of the oyster's shell, your truest treasures are being created in the protected sanctuary of your inner world. The constant pressure of external demands, the irritation of having to explain your sensitivity to those who see it as inconvenience rather than gift, the endless request to pour yourself out for others who may not even pause to see the emptiness they leave behind. All of this becomes the raw material from which your wisdom is crystallizing. But pearls cannot form in rushing water. They require the stillness of depths, the patience of darkness, the protection that comes from being held in something that understands their value. Your withdrawal provides this sacred container, this holy vessel in which your experiences are transformed from mere suffering into luminous understanding. There is a difference between loneliness and aloneness that the hurried world cannot understand. A distinction that Gibran drew with the precision of a master who had walked both paths and knew their separate destinations. Loneliness is the ache of disconnection, the hunger for recognition that comes from a soul that has forgotten its own worth, that seeks in others what it has not yet learned to find within itself. But aloneness, true aloneness, is the homecoming of a spirit that has learned to find its completion not in the endless validation of others, but in the deep well of its own being. Loneliness drives us toward others from a place of emptiness, seeking to fill the void with temporary connections that often leave us feeling more isolated than before. But aloneness draws us toward ourselves from a place of fullness, inviting us to drink from the spring that never runs dry, to commune with the part of ourselves that is never truly separate from the infinite source of all comfort and companionship. In the marketplace of personalities, where every soul is expected to perform its worth through external metrics of success and sociability, the one who chooses solitude is often seen as failing to participate in the game that everyone else has agreed to play. But what if the game itself is the problem? What if the very rules by which modern society measures worth and connection are designed to keep souls perpetually hungry, perpetually seeking outside themselves what can only be found within? You are not lost. You are simply becoming too vast for your old life. When Gibran wrote of the soul's journey, he understood that there are seasons when the spirit must turn inward, when it must close its doors to the world, not out of fear, but out of love. Love for the tender shoots of new understanding that need protection to grow. Love for the quiet voice of intuition that can only be heard when the external noise subsides. Love for the authentic self that emerges only when we stop performing for an audience that was never meant to understand our deeper symphony. He knew, as all mystics know, that the soul has its own weather patterns, its own cycles of expansion and contraction, its own need for the restorative darkness that precedes every dawn. The caterpillar does not dissolve itself in the chrysalis because it has given up on flying. It dissolves because flying requires a complete transformation of its very being, a metamorphosis so profound that it cannot happen while maintaining the old form. the old way of moving through the world. Your sensitivity is not a flaw to be fixed or a weakness to be overcome. It is the instrument through which you receive the subtle frequencies of truth that others cannot detect. It is the compass that points not toward what the world expects, but toward what your soul requires for its evolution. Like a finely tuned violin that cannot bear to be played roughly, like a delicate seismograph that registers tremors, too subtle for cruder instruments to detect, your sensitivity serves a purpose that extends far beyond your personal comfort. But instruments require care. They need to be handled with reverence, protected from harsh conditions, given time to rest between performances. A master musician does not apologize for storing their precious instrument in a case when it is not being used. They understand that protection preserves the very qualities that make the instrument capable of creating beauty when the time for music arrives. And sometimes what your soul requires is the healing balm of withdrawal, the medicine of silence, the restoration that comes only from stepping away from stages where you were never meant to perform. Sometimes it requires the courage to say no to invitations that would diminish rather than expand your capacity to offer your unique gifts to the world. In the sacred texts of many traditions, we find the pattern repeated again and again with the consistency of natural law. The prophet retreats to the mountain. The seeker finds the cave. The wise one discovers the hermitage. Moses on Sinai, Jesus in the wilderness, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Muhammad in the cave of Hira. Not because they are afraid of people, but because they understand that certain truths can only be received in solitude, certain healings can only happen in silence, certain transformations can only unfold when we stop explaining ourselves to a world that measures worth by external metrics. These great souls knew what you are beginning to remember, that the most important conversations are not the ones we have with others, but the ones we have with the infinite intelligence that speaks through the silence, the divine presence that emerges only when we create enough space for it to be felt, seen, and heard. Your pain is the soft hand that shapes your awakening. The modern world has created an epidemic of spiritual exhaustion that it refuses to acknowledge, a collective depletion of the very energies that make life sacred and meaningful. It demands that every soul shine with the same borrowed light, speak with the same borrowed voice, dream with the same borrowed dreams. Like a factory that runs its machines beyond their capacity, never allowing time for maintenance or rest, this world pushes sensitive souls beyond their natural limits and then wonders why so many are breaking down. The symptoms are everywhere, though few recognize them as symptoms of spiritual starvation. The inability to feel joy in things that once brought delight. The exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. The sense of going through the motions of a life that feels increasingly foreign to the truth of who you are. The feeling of being surrounded by people yet profoundly alone, speaking words that seem to fall into a void of misunderstanding. And when a soul knows itself well enough to say no, when it chooses the sanctuary of its own company over the performance of false connection, it is labeled as troubled, as antisocial, as somehow deficient in the very qualities that make for a rich and meaningful life. The irony is breathtaking. Those who have lost touch with their own souls prescribe more disconnection as the cure for disconnection. Those who have forgotten how to be alone with themselves, without distraction or noise, insist that salvation lies in constant engagement with others who are equally lost. But you have begun to understand something that the rushing crowds cannot see, a truth that emerges only when the noise subsides long enough for wisdom to speak. You have begun to recognize that what they call living as often just an elaborate form of sleepwalking that what they call connection is often just an exchange of masks, that what they call success is often just a sophisticated form of spiritual starvation, like a person who has been eating artificial food for so long that they have forgotten the taste of real nourishment. The modern soul has become accustomed to artificial connection, artificial purpose, artificial meaning. It takes time away from these substitutes to remember what authentic nourishment feels like, what genuine connection tastes like, what real purpose moves like in the depths of the heart. Your withdrawal is not escape, it is awakening. It is the recognition that your energy, your attention, your very life force are sacred resources that deserve to be invested with wisdom rather than scattered carelessly among those who do not understand their value. You are not rejecting humanity. You are refusing to dilute your humanity in the endless stream of shallow encounters that leave both giver and receiver feeling somehow emptier than before. Think of the wise farmer who knows that even the most fertile soil will become barren if it is never allowed to rest, never given time to restore its minerals, never permitted the fallowness that precedes the most abundant harvests. Your soul, too, follows these ancient rhythms of cultivation and rest, of giving and receiving, of opening and closing. In the quiet sanctuary of your chosen solitude, something miraculous begins to happen, something that can only occur when the constant outward flow of attention is finally allowed to reverse its direction and flow inward toward its source. The authentic voice that was drowned out by the chorus of external expectations begins to speak again tentatively at first, like a stream that has been dammed finally finding its way around the obstacles that blocked its natural course. The dreams that were buried under the weight of other people's definitions of success begin to stir with new life, like seeds that have been waiting through a long winter for the warmth that signals it is safe to emerge. The creative force that was channeled into maintaining relationships that drained rather than nourished begins to flow toward purposes that align with your deepest truth, like a river that has been forced through artificial channels, finally returning to its natural bed. In this sacred space of withdrawal, you begin to notice things that were invisible when your attention was scattered across 1,000 surface concerns. You notice the way morning light moves across your wall with the slow patience of something that knows its worth is not dependent on being witnessed. You notice the way silence has its own texture, its own depth, its own capacity to hold and heal things that noise only aggravates. You begin to remember the rhythm of your own breathing, the beating of your own heart, the particular way your soul moves through the world when it is not trying to accommodate everyone else's pace. You rediscover the unique frequency of your own thoughts when they are not being constantly interrupted by the urgent but unimportant demands that others mistake for the substance of living. What you call fear is the shadow of the truth trying to reach you. Gibran understood that the soul has its own seasons, its own rhythms, its own requirements for health and growth that bear no resemblance to the artificial schedules that human society has imposed upon natural processes. Just as the farmer knows when the field needs to lie fallow, when the soil needs rest to restore its fertility, when the earth needs time to compost its experiences into the rich humus from which new growth springs, the wise soul knows when it needs to step back from giving, from performing, from being available to every demand that others place upon its energy. This is not selfishness. This is stewardship of the sacred, the recognition that you have been entrusted with something precious that requires protection, cultivation, and wise management. This is the understanding that you cannot give from an empty well, that you cannot light others' candles if your own flame has been reduced to a flickering ember by the constant winds of external expectation. Like the temple priests who understood that certain spaces must be kept pure, certain flames must be tended with unwavering attention, certain silences must be preserved against the encroachment of profane noise. You are learning to guard the sanctuary of your inner world, with the devotion it deserves. You are learning to be the guardian of your own sacred fire, the keeper of your own holy flame. And slowly, in the blessed sanctuary of your own company, you begin to remember who you were before the world told you who you should be. You begin to hear the voice that was speaking before others taught you to silence it in favor of more acceptable songs. You begin to feel the rhythm that was beating in your heart before it was drowned out by the march of conformity that never leads anywhere worth going. The cocoon does not apologize for its darkness, does not justify its withdrawal to the flowers that continue blooming in the open air, does not explain its need for solitude to the birds that sing their songs for all to hear. It understands something fundamental that the human world has forgotten, that certain transformations require the protection of withdrawal, the safety of solitude, the darkness that precedes the emergence of wings. Within the seeming limitation of the chrysalis, the greatest miracle of metamorphosis unfolds. The caterpillar, which could only crawl along the surface of things, dissolves its very structure so completely that if you were to cut open the cocoon midway through the process, you would find not a half-formed butterfly, but a soup of undifferentiated possibility, a primordial chaos from which an entirely new form of being is about to emerge. Your desire to step back from the world is not a sign of weakness. It is the wisdom of a soul that knows it is preparing for flight, that recognizes it needs space to become what it is meant to be, that understands the profound vulnerability of transformation and honors it with the protection it requires. You are not becoming less than you were. You are becoming so much more that your current form can no longer contain what you are becoming. The butterfly that emerges from its time of withdrawal is not the same creature that entered the cocoon. It has not simply grown larger or stronger. It has undergone a complete metamorphosis that gives it access to dimensions of existence that were previously impossible to imagine. Where once it could only crawl along the ground, now it can dance with the wind. Where once it could only eat leaves, now it feeds on the nectar of flowers. Where once it could only see the world from a worm's perspective, now it can see the vast patterns that connect all things. This is what your withdrawal is preparing you for, not a retreat from life, but access to dimensions of living that are impossible to reach from your current level of functioning. Not a lessening of your capacity to contribute to the world, but a fundamental transformation of the gifts you have to offer and the way you offer them. The soul grows where the world believes you are breaking. In the silence of your sanctuary, you discover that you were never alone, that the aloneness you feared was actually the end of a false kind of connection and the beginning of a true one. You were simply clearing space to meet the deeper companions that had been waiting patiently for the noise to subside, the ancient voices that speak in whispers too subtle for distracted minds to detect. You find the wisdom of the ancestors who chose mountains over marketplaces, and not because they disdained commerce, but because they understood that certain kinds of wealth can only be accumulated in solitude. You connect with the lineage of mystics who understood that the most important conversations happen not between people, but between the soul and the infinite mystery, from which it came, to which it belongs, and with which it can commune only in the stillness that the world mistakes for emptiness. In the traditions of the desert fathers, in the practices of the forest monks, in the way of the mountain hermits, we find the same understanding repeated across cultures and centuries, that there is a kind of knowledge that can only be received in solitude, a kind of healing that can only happen in silence, a kind of transformation that can only unfold when we stop trying to explain ourselves to a world that was never designed to understand the deeper rhythms of spiritual development. Your withdrawal becomes not an escape from life, but a return to life's source. Not a rejection of love, but a preparation for love of a deeper quality than the surface connections that leave so many people feeling lonely, even in crowds, even in relationships, even in families that share the same roof, but not the same depth of understanding. In the quiet spaces, you remember that you are not separate from the vast intelligence that moves the stars and shapes the seasons, that breathes life into every form and withdraws it according to laws too sublime for human minds to fully grasp. You recall that you are not an isolated fragment trying to find connection, but a unique expression of the one consciousness that breathes through all things, a note in the infinite symphony that has never stopped playing even when your ears were too full of noise to hear its music. And from this remembrance comes a different kind of engagement with the world, a way of being present that is rooted not in need, but in fullness, not in the desperate hunger for validation, but in the natural overflow of a vessel that has been filled from its own source. Not the frantic seeking of the spiritually hungry, but the gentle overflow of the spiritually nourished. Not the desperate attempt to prove your worth through endless giving, but the natural sharing that comes from a well that has been allowed to refill from its underground springs. You do not walk toward meaning. Meaning walks toward you when you become still. Those who love you truly, those whose connection with you is based on who you actually are rather than who they need you to be, will understand your seasons of withdrawal. They will recognize that you are not moving away from connection, but preparing for a deeper form of connection that can only come from someone who has learned to be whole in their own presence. They will see that your solitude is not rejection of relationship, but preparation for relationships based on authenticity rather than need, on overflow rather than depletion, on the meeting of two complete beings rather than the desperate grasping of two halves hoping to make a whole. And those who do not understand, those who interpret your healthy boundaries as personal rejection, those who demand that you exhaust yourself in the service of their comfort, reveal themselves as companions of your smaller life, not the vast existence that is calling you forward. They show themselves to be allies of your limitations, not supporters of your expansion, friends of your wounds, rather than champions of your healing. In the desert of your chosen aloneness, you discover that what you thought was emptiness was actually spaciousness. What you thought was silence was actually the sound of your own soul breathing. What you thought was loneliness was actually the profound companionship of being at home with yourself. Like the desert mystics who found in the vastness of sand and sky a mirror of the infinite spaces within their own hearts, you learn that solitude is not the absence of company, but the presence of the only companion who will never leave you, never misunderstand you, never ask you to be anything other than what you are. The great secret that Gibran knew, that all the wisdom traditions whisper to those who have ears to hear, is that the soul's journey toward wholeness sometimes requires a temporary withdrawal from the fragments, a stepping back from the pieces to see the larger pattern, a return to the center to remember the circumference of your true nature. This withdrawal is not permanent exile, but temporary retreat, not final destination, but necessary preparation for a return to engagement that is informed by solitude rather than driven by compulsion. Your desire to withdraw is not a problem to be solved, but a solution to a problem the world doesn't want to acknowledge. It is the medicine your soul prescribes for the inflammation of constant exposure, the healing balm for wounds that can only mend in the privacy of your own presence, the treatment for a spiritual condition that has no name in the diagnostic manuals, but affects millions of souls who have forgotten how to be alone without feeling lonely, how to be quiet without feeling empty, how to rest without feeling guilty. And when you emerge from your cocoon of solitude, when you return to engagement with the world after your time of sacred withdrawal, you will not be the same person who retreated. You will be someone who has remembered their worth, who has reconnected with their source, who has learned to distinguish between the voice of wisdom and the noise of compulsion, between the call of authentic purpose and the demands of social expectation. You will be someone who can say yes from choice rather than fear, who can give from abundance rather than emptiness, who can love from wholeness rather than need. Your withdrawal will have taught you the most important lesson of all, that you are not responsible for being everything to everyone, but you are responsible for being true to the one soul that was given into your care, the one life that you have been asked to steward with wisdom and courage and compassion, like the tree that drops its leaves in autumn, not from weakness, but from wisdom, knowing that some things must be released so that new growth can emerge in spring. You have learned the sacred art of letting go. You have learned that saying no to what diminishes you is how you say yes to what expands you, that stepping away from what drains you is how you step toward what nourishes you, that withdrawing from what makes you small is how you make space for what makes you vast. The dawn waits for no one, but welcomes all who rise. If this spoke to your spirit, write in the comments, "I'm awakening now."